You're about to enter into a new world of knowledge, curiosities, and high strangeness. This is a podcast of Straight Up Strange Productions.
You're listening to Mysteries and Monsters. I'm your host, Paul Bestel. Author Chad Lewis joins me as we look into some of the strange traditions and customs that surround us throughout the winter months. From St. Nicholas to smoking the house, wassailing to Yule logs, this time of year is full of strange and unusual customs hiding in plain sight. We also look at some of the darker creatures that lurk in the shadows of winter, from the Krampus, Belsnickel, and we discuss a more recent encounter with a Wendigo. It's always fun speaking with Chad, and I'm sure you'll enjoy where we go. Before that though, as always, don't forget you can support Mysteries and Monsters by signing up at patreon.com/mysteriesandmonsters. $4 a month gets you ad-free episodes, guaranteed early releases, bonus content, competitions, and more. You can also click the link in the show notes as always. Thank you to my two latest patrons, Heather and Kimberly. Thank you, and thank you to everyone who subscribes through the Patreon. It's really appreciated, so thank you. Mysteries and Monsters is across all social media platforms: Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Mastodon, and please subscribe to the Mysteries and Monsters channel on YouTube. You can also visit mysteriesandmonsters.com for news, episodes, and merchandise. Thank you as always to Dean Bestel for his marvellous artwork. The show is produced by Brennan Storr of the Ghost Story Guys, and Mysteries and Monsters is delighted to be a part of the Straight Up Strange network. So let's join Chad as we look into the legends and lore of these darkest months. As the dark nights continue to cling to our windows and doors throughout the winter, many of us find ourselves indulging in some strange, yet traditional winter pastimes. From bringing certain plants into our homes, celebrating the solstice, and the usual giving of presents. In his latest book, Winter Legends and Lore, Chad Lewis takes us on a journey into some of the weird, wonderful, and downright strange things people do at this time of year. Chad, welcome back.
Greetings from the North Woods of Wisconsin.
Absolutely. We are connected through our unseasonably warm winter, it would seem, today.
Oh. I had to put my blinds down. I'm afraid they're going to kick me out of Wisconsin. I'm talking about Winter Legends. It's 50 degrees Fahrenheit and sunny. I'm embarrassed.
What is going on, Chad? These are strange times indeed, sir.
I know. I'm afraid they're going to make me move down south to Iowa or Illinois or something because I'm a fake here living in the winter bliss of Wisconsin.
It's the new Florida, Chad.
Don't say that, please. Don't say that. I have family in Florida, and I'm going to be down there in February chasing the skunk ape and a few other things. So hopefully I can bring some of the colder weather with me.
Yeah. Well, I know they had one of those, it always gets reported over here, Chad, they have one of those unseasonably cold snaps that freezes all the iguanas in the trees, and they all fall out, don't they?
Yes, and you know, my family's from Wisconsin, and they moved down there 20 years ago. And there's something about getting used to where you live, because when temperatures get there to about 60 degrees Fahrenheit there, they call me saying it's so cold. And I'll say, well, it's minus 30 here. And they'll say, yeah, it's different down here. And I say, yeah, about 80 degrees warmer. That's the difference. But there's something about your perception of once you leave the cold climates, you know, you really can't handle it anymore.
It is something I find quite odd. I remember a friend of mine who lives in London, which is only 200 miles away, Chad. We're not talking as far as some of the distances like Wisconsin and Florida. And he brought up his new partner, who had never been this far north before, and she came up in January, and she was absolutely freezing. She had to wear 3 coats.
Yeah, I love that. And it's the exact opposite, too, that living here for so long, as when I was joking with you earlier, that if it becomes 35 degrees and it may have snowed the night before, it's not unusual for me to see neighbors shoveling in shorts and a light sweatshirt.
Yeah.
It's just beach weather at 50.
Yeah, get the deck chairs out, Chad. What are you doing?
Exactly.
Well, your latest book, as I mentioned in the introduction, is a collection from all over the place in regards to some of these strange winter legends and lore. And I suppose, as someone that's always had a deep interest in folklore and these kind of traditions, regardless of the subjects we've discussed previously, Chad, I would suspect that the hardest thing about a book like this is keeping it as focused on the subjects that you've covered in the various chapters included in it.
It really was. For me, the difficult thing was keeping it more of a slimmer book. It comes in just over 100 pages, and I easily could have done 1,000 pages. But I wanted it to be not really a Cliff Notes, but the best of the best that I've discovered over the years that people who are interested in this stuff, like you and myself, we're in the minority, that most of the people I speak to at my presentations and a lot of people who purchase my books are the general public who have an interest, but not an obsession in this stuff. So they want to know the history of Santa Claus, but not 500 pages about it. They're not looking to become a scholar on these subjects, but they're interested in a nice article-sized chapter. So that's what I really was trying to go for here with this book, to give it a good jumping off point, that if you read some chapter on how to predict if you're going to have a hard winter or not, it gives you enough to get started. And if you want to dive in on your own, that's great. But for those who are not as interested, you certainly won't be bored, because by the time you get to the 2-3 pages in, it's a new chapter, a whole new phenomena or legend or folklore to deal with.
I think as well with some of these subjects, such as Santa Claus, you can essentially, as you mentioned there, you could write a volume of over 1,000 pages based on all the previous literature and traditions from around the world if you just looked at Father Christmas. And I think, as you say there, some people, as much as they love Christmas, and then when they buy a book like this, Father Christmas is probably the one they're not really that interested in, if that makes sense.
Certainly not all the details, not all the grime. They're interested in, again, I wish there was something better than Cliff Notes, because Cliff Notes has that kind of terrible connotation with it that is cheating, just a little bit of everything. But it really is. It's like, yes, I'm interested in St. Nicholas and Father Christmas and the ties to Odin and all that. But again, I have several books on my shelf here that are 300, 400, 500 pages on Santa, or I have a couple on the origin of the Christmas tree, entire books devoted to that, where even someone like myself who's insanely interested in this, midway through, I'm thinking, okay, I got it. I don't need another 300 pages. And for most people that I'm trying to reach, they don't have the time or energy to devote to all of these things, because, again, they have an interest, but it's not an obsession.
Do you think, as we propel ourselves into the 21st century, chat, maybe this is just my perception from being here in the UK, I'm really surprised how much looking back people have started to do in regards to what was going on 100, 200 years ago in regards to certain traditions, not just necessarily because a lot of people are following the pagan path these days and considering themselves as practitioners of a variety of Wicca, but also I think for some people there seems to be a real connection with this season, more than just the standard sharing of presents and Halloween being the start of the winter for a lot of people. Has that sort of been something that you've noticed more of a trend of around the world, or especially in specific states in the US?
Here in America, Christmas has always been the ruler for holidays. There's nothing that comes close to it. Halloween's encroaching, but it will probably never surpass the Christmas holiday for those who celebrate it here in America. And I think what I hear from a lot of people over the last couple decades is that they're fed up with it. They love it, but they're upset about how commercial it has become. And it's really become about who can buy the most expensive gift for somebody, gifts that we don't want or need. And they really lost the reason for the season, if you will. That they're looking for some significance, some importance. And I think that when you look back and start adhering to a lot of these traditions and customs and rituals that people have been doing for thousands of years, at least in my own opinion, it adds a lot of meaning to the winter season, much more than any gift. So just knowing the origin of a Christmas tree or the Yule log or all these weird winter monsters, I think it connects you with people from all over the world that have been doing this for thousands of years. And I take great comfort and solace in doing that, knowing that I'm part of a tradition that will probably continue long after I'm gone.
Yeah. Do you have things in certain states that are unique to each state, Chad? Because often here in the UK, we've got some very odd things that go off in different areas of the country in winter, which I'll touch on later on for you. But one of the things I was interested in is this tradition about letting the old year out and the new year in. Here where I live in Yorkshire, one of the traditions, which I remember being a small child, being thrown outside on just as midnight was approaching, Chad, with a piece of coal in my hand, to knock on the door and be welcomed in to bring the new year in with me. And when I was looking at the book, it's interesting that a lot of places still have something similar where they leave a window open or a door open to let the old out and bring the new in.
I think it's most important. So there's a tradition on Christmas Eve of opening a door or window at midnight, and that's to allow the spirit of Christmas into your home. But on New Year's Eve at midnight, you're supposed to open a door or a window, not only to allow the new year in, but more importantly, to allow the previous year to escape. All the negativity, all the rottenness of the previous year, it exits your home and allows the new year to come in with a clean start, so you'll have a wealthier and healthier new year. And today, a lot of people forgot the origins that in the old days, people would take it even further, where communities would have giant bonfires where they would try to burn away the previous year for the new year to come in. And they'd be drinking, of course, they'd have fireworks, and then they'd shoot their guns into the air to try to murder the previous year so the new year could come in. So when we think of just cracking our window or door, it seems very tame to the way it used to be.
Yeah, I must admit, that was really eye-opening for me. I know you mentioned some people even used to shoot the trees, did they not, Jet?
Well, in the Wassailing, which is where our tradition in America of caroling comes from, the old Wassailing tradition of going door to door or going to your orchard. And it was meant to wake the trees up. But shooting with your shotgun or rifle into the branches was meant to scare away all the evil that was living in the orchard, all the creatures that lurked in the darkness, because these were, after all, the darkest days of the year. And so much of the lights around the holiday season were meant to be a reminder of light overcoming darkness, but also to scare away evil that was seemingly everywhere in those days. So a lot of the earliest caroling here in America, people were doing it with pots and pans and drums and making as much noise as they could to scare away everything, more so than bringing good community cheer and a sense of camaraderie with your neighbors. It was done for those purposes too, but mainly to scare away everything and to wake up the trees so they'll produce for the following year's crop.
Yeah. It's a very odd thing. I remember as a young man walking in the early part of the year, Chad, I remember walking through a bit of a wood, and I noticed that one of the trees had loads of pieces of bread stuck on it. And at the time I thought, well, that's a bit strange, but I lived in a strange area. So I just thought, that's just somebody being odd. I now know that here in the UK, that's how some people do their wassailing, Chad. They will attach pieces of bread to a tree and pour cider over the roots as a sort of offering in regards to a plentiful year to come.
That's still done here in America, where if you have some trees, you pick one or two of the most important. You go out with your usually a spiked hot cider of some sort, wassail, and you drink it, and then you'd pour it on the roots, as you said, as an offering. And then you would hang stuff, toast, fruit, other things in the tree as an offering so that the tree will produce. Because in the old days, it literally was a matter of life and death, whether you had enough food to survive or not. So they would sing around these trees, which is where the earliest caroling came from, because they would sing songs to the trees, again, to show their respect for the orchard. And then when they were finished with all that, they would even take sticks and start smacking those sticks against the trunk of the tree just to make sure the tree woke up for the next season.
It is a very strange thing, I have to say. Now, even now, as an adult with more of an intuition and knowledge of that particular pastime, Chad, I find that remarkable that people, because I suppose as well, when you look back on how long that tradition's been running, some people may not have had that much produce able to spare. So it clearly shows how much faith they put in such a thing, that they were prepared to give up some valuable food and liquids in the hope that they would receive something else over the forthcoming year in that regard.
I consider it as them investing in themselves, that they're investing this food, drink, and part of it was bringing the neighbors together. And here in my home in Wisconsin, I have a couple apple trees, a couple pear trees, and I'm out doing it every year as well. Not because I need the fruit, but because I love the idea of paying the respect to the trees and they're producing. And I love the history of it and just all of the, thousands of years of doing this. It's just magical out there. And I don't know if it works. Every year I get about the same, it seems like, to the untrained eye. But, maybe if I didn't, they'd all be dead.
Well, if it's usually, why take a chance, chap?
Yeah, you lose absolutely nothing. It's a fun ritual to do. And there are so many recipes and songs online for make your own wassail drink. You can find them all online, make it any way you like, and then different songs to sing around the tree. And it's just so much fun. You can invite your neighbors, and it's something to look forward to in the dark months. And I think that was half the battle in the old days, that trying to think about making it through the entire winter was devastating. It was hard. It's like trying to think about running an entire marathon. But if you think, okay, I can make it to the solstice, no problem. From the solstice, I can make it to Christmas Eve, to New Year's Eve, to the Epiphany, and so on. Baby steps that I can make it a week, but I don't want to think about making it, 100 days.
Mm-hmm. And I suppose as well, when we look back at some of the older traditions such as this, for some people it was probably a time that they were able to see each other as well, because it would depend where you lived, depended on the weather. And for some, it may be the first time they'd seen people for a few weeks at the very least. So just to get out for their own health more than anything and socialise would probably be a good reason to be doing it as well.
Which is exactly where the drinking comes into effect.
Yes.
Of the having fun with your neighbors. And you're absolutely correct that the majority of non-Indigenous people here in America, the early ones, were farmers that came over. And you're right that they'd be so busy and spread out during the season that it wasn't until the downtime of winter when they could kind of let their hair down, if you will, bring out the musical instruments, start playing, start talking, swapping stories with the neighbors, looking for advice of what's working, what's not working. And it was something that they needed because, at some point you're getting kind of cabin fever with your own family. You need some outside entertainment or camaraderie, which is exactly why they came up with so many of these festivals.
Mm-hmm. Very much so. And I suppose as well, that leads us on to something else that's kind of connected in the olden days with farming, which is this connection with the little people, Chad, which is one of those traditions that I think, especially in Western Europe and the Americas, wherever you go, countries and people from all backgrounds and all parts of that particular area all seem to have very similar stories about little people who are either in and around their homes or located in nearby woods or glens or whatever. And it's this kind of symbiotic relationship that seems to have built up over these people who were working in the farming industry over those years, for a lot of them, who had this kind of adulation towards these little people wherever they may be.
The little people, and most people might think of like gnomes or elves or fairies, but the little people were thought to be the inhabitants of the land, the protectors of land. And again, when most non-indigenous people here were farmers, it was believed that you needed these little people who often lived out in the barn, in the stables. You needed them for your farm to succeed, that they could communicate with animals. They could cure minor ailments of the animals. They would look after your barn doing the chores. They would help make sure your crops were plentiful, and they'd help doing all sorts of things. But in the winter, when it got really cold, they would often like to come inside of your dwelling, your home, which is why it was advised in the winter to leave out offerings for the little people, whether it was some baked goods, some candy, some treats, some spirits, something so when they come in, they will feel respected and you're honoring their work. And otherwise, perhaps your animals go lame, your crops fail. All of a sudden, there's a lot of accidents on your farm. Things aren't going right. That's because of the little people. And all of these legends came over with our ancestors that came here for us non-indigenous people. You know, and in Europe, they have the Nissa and the Tomten and all these little people that live out on the properties. But here's, Paul, where I always make this question of, as more and more of us have left the countryside and the farm life to move into cities and towns, what happens to these little people? Do they stay there on their ancient lands, or do they come into the cities? And for me, I'm always leaving out offerings just in case they've come into the city as well. You know, there's no harm in it, but that's a great question of, does the folklore die, or does it morph and progress as society does?
It is strange, isn't it, when you think about how entrenched that relationship used to be? Because here in the Peak District, not far from where I am, there was a long tradition of that kind of relationship with boggarts, as they used to call them, Chad, up there. And that was exactly the same kind of relationship, that if you wanted a well-run farm or a well-run homestead, you would often leave out milk or biscuits or bread or whatever to make sure that everything ran smoothly. And sometimes they may even go above and beyond the call of duty and tidy the house, clean the fire out, make sure your house didn't burn down if you left the fire on overnight.
And really, it was a small price to pay, leaving out a few things in the off chance that these things are helping out. And again, it was thought that it was life and death back then, that today, luckily, in the developed world, most of us have enough food that we're not going to starve to death. But that was a real fear for people in the old days, that they were surviving on their own. There might not be neighbors from miles away. And so whatever they couldn't produce or make or rely on themselves for was a threat to their survival. So if there's these little people around who seem to be great at what they're doing, why not take advantage of that?
Absolutely. Is that something that it depends on the immigrant population that moved to specific states in the US as to which particular little person now resides in that state, Chad? Or is it very much a kind of blanket kind of belief in certain communities about, regardless, it's a little person?
Today, it seems to be mostly a combination where you will get these diehards, but because most of the people that came here have been here for generation after generation, a lot of that has been lost, that making it very specific to the country of origin has been lost a little bit. But at the same time, there are pockets here in the Midwest where people have moved here, and they told me when we moved here, we had no idea that we had to put our shoes out for St. Nicholas to come visit. We thought Christmas, you put out your stockings for Santa. We had no idea you had to put out your shoes for St. Nicholas as well. But the saint was so regarded in the Midwest that so many people still celebrate that as much as they do Christmas. So for a lot of people moving into the Midwestern portion of the United States, that was a huge change for them. They had never heard that before in their entire lives.
Yeah. I remember one of my friends being very confused about the fact that even as adults, we would still leave out a glass of sherry and a mince pie on Christmas Eve for Father Christmas.
Yeah.
And he couldn't get his head around it. He was like, you're 30 odd. What are you doing? It's Christmas. What's wrong with you?
Yeah, I think it's great. I think the tradition of leaving out whether, in the old days, they would leave out hay as well for some of the animals that would, because in America, Santa Claus has the reindeer, of course, but the rest of the world, he has an assortment of different creatures following him. So in America, we might leave out some cookies and milk, of course, but also some carrots for the reindeer. But in other countries and other cultures, they leave out hay. They'll leave out water, making sure that those animals are fed too. And I love the idea of it. And it really just brings us back to the whole idea of the season about giving. That's what the season was meant for. And in a small way, leaving out some hay might not seem like a big deal, but it encourages children to think about others and to be in the giving spirit.
I think it's interesting, that particular aspect of it as well. Now, I don't know if this happens in the States, but it certainly happens here, Chad, that in December, McDonald's always advertise the fact that if you buy a Happy Meal, you'll get a free bag of reindeer food for the kids. So they so they can take it home with them and leave it. Now, is that, obviously, by the sounds of it, that's clearly something that only happens in the UK? Is that not something that goes on in the US? Because I find it interesting when big corporations sort of do something like that, which is quite unexpected.
Wow, that's the best thing I've heard in a long time. And I can't imagine that the American counterparts wouldn't follow through with that. But then again, here in America, it's kind of a sticky situation because many people still regard Christmas as a religious holiday, even though many secular people celebrate it as much, if not more, than those that are of a Christian faith. So it might be kind of that where these corporations might not want to get into the debate of it all. But I think something like that, when Coca-Cola can tie themselves with Santa and many other companies, and throughout history, there were many liquor companies, even cigarette companies would tie themselves to Santa, So I think that's a brilliant idea, and just how fun that would be to get some reindeer food to bring home.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's one of those things, it keeps the magic alive for the younger ones as well. So anything like that, I'm always a big fan of, because I'm quite a traditional Christmas kind of person. So anything that keeps that magic going for the youngest should be something that should be celebrated, regardless of who's behind it.
I was thinking about this when I was writing the book, that here in America and probably Europe as well, that you really only have a couple years of a magic Christmas where you're old enough to understand Santa and what he represents and what he does, bringing you gifts. But you're not old enough where your friends are trying to convince you to grow up. So you have really about between the ages of 5 to maybe 10 or 11-ish. And those are like the golden years of Christmas. And what's interesting is that I was reading a book about Christmas the other day, and the author brought up a wonderful point that the gift you get from Santa Claus might be equivalent in price or quantity as what you might get from your birthday. But the present from Santa is on such a grander scale that you're thinking about it for a month and a half before it comes. When you receive it, it's the most special thing in the world. I mean, the rating of it versus what you get for your birthday in terms of pleasure and significance of it, it's just crazy, the difference. And that shows how important the idea of Santa Claus is and has been, that it's the same gift, but yet because of where it comes from and who delivered it, it's a much better gift. And again, it's just sad because what's that, 5 years, 6 years maybe, where you have that golden zone where Christmas is the end all and be all. And I think a lot of us that are older are trying to recoup that, trying to re-experience that. And a lot of these rituals, I think, can fulfill a lot of that nostalgia.
Yeah. I think you get to a certain point as a young person, Chad, that when you're not sneaking downstairs at 6 a.m. just to make sure he's been, and you get to a certain age where you wait for your parents to wake you up. I think that's when that's when you've gone through that change, I think, Chad.
I do too, and I think it's one we would all be great to revert back to. That waking up or having a hard time, I think a lot of people do have a hard time getting to bed on Christmas Eve, but for different reasons than the excitement of the next morning. But I know for me, just in the several years that I was working on collecting all of this research, the entire holiday season, it has become more pleasurable than it ever has. And it, it's on par for me as when I was in that golden age of birthdays where I love the season. And when the season starts to dwindle out in February, I miss it.
Yeah. Yeah, very much so. I think it is. And the more you learn about folklore and legend, I think the more it allows you to kind of step back in time a bit and have a more appreciation as an adult, because often people will always hark back to a golden age of childhood, as you say, where we were young and innocent and everything was as magical as we could imagine in those days. But I think if you embrace everything else that's going on, there's more to it than just drinking eggnog and watching old films, Chad.
There really is, and there's so much more. I was amazed at how much I had to leave out of this book, and that some things I included in the book, just mere mentioning or brief descriptions of them, are no longer honored today. That, for instance, on New Year's Day, it was thought that in order to bring good luck for you and your family for the entire next year, you'd have to smoke out your house. So you'd start a fire in every fireplace, close all your windows and vents, and let the house smoke up as much as you could handle before you would pass out, and you'd run out into the yard and, breathe in the fresh air.
Yes.
And that was smoking yourself. And when you were done with that, you'd bring your pets in the house and they'd get smoked. And then you'd bring the livestock in.
Yeah.
And out. And then you'd all be blessed with a happy new year, which, can you imagine how long it must have taken for that smoke smell to get out of those homes?
Yes.
People aren't doing that anymore. They'll burn their house down. So I included that because it was so amazing and so fun, but I don't expect anybody probably goes through with that ritual any longer. Much like on the 12th day, January 6th, the Epiphany, it was believed that if anyone knocked on your door and you did not recognize them, if it was a strange person or a strange animal in your yard, by under no circumstances were you to let that thing inside your house, because it was thought that it was a demon in disguise trying to gain entry into your home under the benefit of it being a new year.
Yeah.
And I talk about this at programs, but then I said, well, nobody answers the door to strangers anymore, so we don't even have to worry about that. Half the people in America, it could be the lottery giving you $1 billion and you're not opening the door. You don't know who it is. You're hiding. You're turn off the lights. Nope. So nobody needs that anymore is, I guess, my point. Nobody needs to be worried about letting strangers into their home these days.
Well, there is a very strange connection as well, especially over this period with fire and things, because you've got the attachment to the Yule log, for example, Chad, and I find it's one of those things when you look back on, it does amaze me how many houses didn't go up in flames. Because some people used to just fetch a tree in and just stick it in the fire and just push it in as it burnt further down, which, if you think about it, is highly dangerous. And obviously, some people were rather sensible, Chad, and just chopped it up, put bits on to keep that fire burning throughout. But it's just some of these traditions, you just think, what the hell were people thinking?
You got onto your property, cutting down a tree that you enjoy, and then you'd make a celebration of it on the way back, hauling it to your home, where you would adorn it with some bells and ribbons. You'd be drinking. You'd have your neighbors. You'd be singing. It was a big to-do. And you'd bring it into your home. And again, yes, if you were sensible or undaring, as I like to say, you would chop it up and light the fire with the remnants of last year's Yule log, and then just keep throwing more and more of it in. But I like the people that would take this tree, which was just cut, is green, wet, and you'd throw it into your fireplace and let it burn. And once it needed more fuel, you just kick it in a foot more. And you keep doing that for the 12 days of Christmas, even when you're sleeping. And you're right. How did these people not burn themselves to death every every time they did it, but there must have been something thrilling about it as well.
And there is some interesting additional aspects to the Yule log. It's not just this whole performance of bringing it in and celebrating it and whatever. Different cultures would have different sort of uses for the remnants. I know some people would use the ash as a kind of cure-all. Other people, I think, from the Norse regions believed that the Yule log would shine a light on those that had been departed and make sure that they were still aware that they were welcome in certain houses. So it's not just the burning of the tree or the wood that seemed to symbolise something for a lot of people, is it?
They would keep the coals, if you will, the ash, all that left behind, and it was thought to have magical properties. Depending on where you were in the world, everything from keeping evil spirits out of your home to curing minor ailments or just being a symbol of good luck. And you'd want to keep a twig or a chunk of that wood to start next year's Yule log. And I always tell people when I'm presenting that today a lot of people don't have fireplaces. So what they'll do is they'll burn candles. Some even will use battery-operated candles. And today a lot of streaming services have a Yule log that you can project on your television. And I always state that the symbolism's the same, that light will overcome darkness, that death is on its way out, and that life will return in the spring. But the significance of it being in the fireplace was the fact that, much like Santa, it was thought that spirits and creatures and demons would enter and exit your house through the chimney as well. So by having a fire there, not only would you get heat, light, and you could cook on it, but also it would be literally keeping those spirits out of your house. But the symbolism's still the same. So if you don't have a fireplace or don't want to use a candle, whatever type you want to use, you can just throw it on, your streaming service. And the symbolism remains the same. The intent remains the same, even though society and technology has changed over the decades.
Yeah. I mean, I've been to people's houses in the last few years, Chad, where they've literally just gone on YouTube and put a log burning on a fire on the TV.
I have. So a quick little crazy story. The other day, around the Christmas time, I was sitting up on my little desk area by the front window in the front of my home. And a neighbor of mine across the street, few houses down, in their big pane windows out front, they had a big screen television, the biggest I've ever seen. And it had a fire going on it where for the first 30 seconds, I thought their house was on fire because I could see it. And I couldn't tell it was a screen. It was so big and the flames were going so high.
Yeah.
I said, I think their house is on fire. And then I got a closer look as my eyes adjusted and realized they were just playing a Yule log fire on, Netflix or YouTube, whatever. So that was pretty funny as I really thought a home, because TVs in America are so gigantic nowadays.
Yeah, yeah. I remember as a young chap in the 90s with cable television, we used to get some European channels, Chad, and a lot of them used to shut down about 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock in the morning. One of them would always put a burning fire on, and it would literally be a live broadcast of a fire burning down. People
love that. I think the comfort, and nowadays a lot of people have electric fireplaces. The trouble of lighting it and the danger and all that, just quick flip a switch and it's on. And there's something comforting about fire. Even after all these thousands and thousands of years, humans still are comforted by the sight and the feel of a fire.
Very much so. And I think often, especially when we look at the way people celebrate the solstice, a lot of people build bonfires to celebrate that. They also do it on New Year's Eve, Chad. So there's clearly some kind of long-standing muscle memory that allows us to use fire not just as a protector and a warmth giver, but also as a celebration of the time of the year and what's to come.
It was really a gathering place when you think about having a fire in all of the communities. And on the solstice, many communities still will have, you can see these big bonfires going on the top of the hills, dotting the landscape as a means of getting people together and celebrating the season and just enjoying that you're alive in some of the harshest times that we face here in the winter.
It's surprising how far and how much light is entwined in all of this as well, because I think when we look back, as I was saying about the risks people would take with burning a tree in their house, Chad, when we think about how people used to light their Christmas trees, a lot of people used to use candles, which is one of those things that when we look back, we think, oh, well, what were they thinking? But I suppose it's all they had. Whereas I remember as a child growing up, we used to have a very well-known program, which is still running today, called Blue Peter. And there was a running joke that every Christmas they would build an Advent light, which was essentially 2 wire coat hangers covered in tinsel, Chad. And you'd put 4 candles on this highly flammable thing. And each week preceding Christmas, you would light one until obviously you got to the 4th one that you would light on Christmas Eve. And so as a child, everybody was sort of this running joke about how dangerous kids' telly was by encouraging young children to build highly flammable things to celebrate the oncoming Christmas.
But that's what people had. And the idea of bringing a Christmas tree in, or an evergreen, fir, spruce, whatever you're bringing in, people have been adorning outdoor trees in their celebrations for a very long time. The pagans did it. They would put fruits or whatever they could find on the trees. But the idea of bringing an evergreen into your home, we have our German friends to thank for that. They were the first to do it. And you're right. They would light the trees up with candles because that's all they had. But the light was meant to be a symbol of light overcoming darkness. Again, I sound like a broken record, but that light would return, spring would return, all would be well. Just make it through the season. You'll be okay. But we have to remember that we think, oh my God, they put live candles in these flammable trees. What were they thinking? But at the time, that was before the electric light was invented. That's all they had. That's what they used in their home, candles, or if they had lamps, which were just as dangerous if you knocked them over, maybe more so than a candle. So they were used to candles. They were used to taking that risk because that's the only thing they had. And that's why in America, the Christmas tree really spread like, no pun intended, wildfire when the electric light came by, the stringed light, where it was so much safer and easier. More people were engaged in the season. But for years, I mean, it wasn't uncommon for people in Germany to see in their graveyards on Christmas Eve a Christmas tree lit up so that the dead could celebrate the season just as much as the living.
Well, I think as well, for a lot of people, Christmas is a time where they celebrate everybody, which is something that seems to have drifted away from a lot of places in the modern era, Chad. And I think when we look back, for a lot of people, it was a time to remember as well as celebrate, wasn't it?
It was a time for your ancestors and where you came from and forgotten people. And a lot of it was the dark days of the season was really the scariest time of the year, which is why it was so popular to tell ghost stories in the winter rather than October and Halloween. That traditionally Christmas Eve was the best night to tell a ghost story because it was thought that it was the one night when spirits could not come back and harm you. It was a sacred evening. So you could talk about as many ghosts and goblins and monsters, and there was nothing they could do. That you had free reign. And that's a tradition that's been coming back. You can now go to many bookstores and they have small Victorian aged ghost stories, one story in a small little booklet that are meant to be read out loud with your family on Christmas Eve. And they're marketed as Christmas ghost stories because your family would sit around telling ghost stories on Christmas Eve. And one of the strangest piece of folklore that I found in the entire time I was researching this was the idea that when you were sitting around telling ghost stories by the fire, it was said that if your shadow was on the wall and it did not have a head on the shadow, it meant you were going to die within the next 12 months, that you would not survive. And I can just imagine families scrambling around to make sure everybody had a head on their shadow so everybody was alive. And they even took it further that if you were missing half your head, it meant you might live 6 months, but not the entire year.
Yeah, I can imagine everybody sort of pushing each other out the way in the chairs, scrambling around. Yeah.
And again, we have to realize that in those days, no electricity, obviously, no indoor plumbing. Most of the time you'd be tired once the sun went down. It'd be lit by candles or lamps. That the only thing really to do was to sit around the fire. You might be mending your tools, might be sewing. And at the same time, you're telling stories. If nobody was singing or playing musical instruments, storytelling was the number one hobby or the way to pass the time. So it made sense that when everything's dark out there and the wind's howling through the cracks in your small little one-room cabin and it's complete black dark out there, that was the time for scary stories.
Yeah. Is it something that started reappearing in the States? Because over here in the UK, it was quite a well-loved tradition up until the 1970s. The BBC used to do one every Christmas, Chad. They used to adapt a lot of M.R. James' work and do one at Christmas. And it kind of fell out of favour in the 80s and 90s and the noughties. But over the last 10 years, there's two particular... Well, they're all strangely connected. They're from an ensemble called the League of Gentlemen, who were sort of dark comedians. And Mark Gatiss, who's probably most well known outside of the UK for writing the recent adaptation of Dracula that was out a couple of years ago. And he also redid Sherlock Holmes with Benedict Cumberbatch, Sherlock. So Mark Gatiss has always been a massive fan of the Christmas ghost stories. So he started doing more modern ones. And two of the guys he used to work with do one as well in their sort of horror anthology series called Inside Number 9. And now we've got two separate series who always do a ghost Christmas special.
That's great, because here in America, it was lost. It wasn't until the last several years when I started to see around holiday time that bookstores would carry these specific stories meant for the Christmas season. And often when I present on Winter Legends and Lore, that's one thing many people did not know the tradition. They never knew of telling stories. They always thought of, in America, Halloween is the undisputed king of spooky time, where they didn't think, well, maybe it should be Christmas as well. And it makes sense when you think of the most popular Christmas story, A Christmas Carol, is actually a ghost story. Now, Scrooge being visited by three ghosts and Marley, of course, as well. So that's one tradition that I've really loved seeing make a resurgence in America and putting it in its rightful place of telling stories when they're meant to be told.
Yeah. It is strange how it's completely drifted away and then come back. Obviously, like I say, the guys who are responsible for dragging it back into the modern era are deep lovers of the horror genre anyway, but obviously are also, regardless of their dark sense of humour, quite traditional in the fact that they appreciate the spooky story on Christmas Eve. So it is good to see. I mean, this year we had Count Magus. That was one that they didn't do originally back in the 70s, Chad, because nobody wanted to go to Sweden to film it.
Really?
Yeah.
That's crazy.
Yeah. But yeah, that was quite a creepy one as well, because I wasn't aware of that from the M.R. James canon, actually. So that was probably one of the creepiest ones they've done for a long time, actually.
And again, it just brings me back to, I know I've said it earlier, that knowing these traditions and knowing their history is just something special about it. That I love telling ghost stories year round, especially in October, but there's nothing as satisfying as sitting around on Christmas Eve doing it, because I know that's the old history and the lore of it. It just adds a lot more significance to it. It is much like when you travel the world and try a new food or a new beverage and it's just brilliant. And then you come home and try it and it's not quite the same.
Yeah.
Because it doesn't have that culture, that doesn't have that being there in the history.
Yeah, very much so. And I think as well, the other interesting aspect of all this is that when we're talking about things coming into fashion or things sort of returning from the margins of the Christmas period, I'm still surprised. As much as I love this subject and have spoken with people from all around the world and read everything, I can't believe how ingrained the Krampus seems to be now, Chad, all over the world. It seems to have just come from something I saw once on a late night TV show 25 years ago to, even having a regular Christmas run here in Whitby, which is probably a a suitable location for it to be held in the UK, where they now have a Krampus run at the beginning of December. Even with your love of this particular subject and folklore, are you surprised at how popular the Krampus has become? Or do you think it's just quite obvious that people would gravitate towards something a bit darker at this particular period these days?
I love the fact that Krampus is not becoming popular here. It's re-becoming popular. And what I mean by that is, I'm sure many of your listeners know the Krampus story, but in America, I dug up a lot of stories from the early 1900s that reporters were upset because they were talking about when St. Nicholas would come and deliver presents and food and coin and treats for the children in their shoes. He was to reward the good children. And Krampus's job, obviously, was to punish the ill-behaved children. And that the story was that St. Nicholas would leave behind a little statue of himself to the children who were well-behaved. And the naughty children would get a little statue of Krampus. And these early 1900 newspapers, the reporters were upset because they said, overwhelmingly, most of the kids wanted the Krampus statue. So Krampus was hugely popular in the 1800s and early 1900s, and even beyond that earlier. But it wasn't until, I'm guessing, 1920 or so when it really faded out here in America, where people forgot about it. They didn't want anything to do with it. Too scary, too pagan, too devilish. And then the last 10, 20 years, you're right, it has exploded like nothing I have ever seen, where more and more communities are getting together on the evening of St. Nicholas night, on the evening of December 5th going into December 6th. And they celebrate with parades and people dressed as Krampus that will whip you with their birch switch. And people love it. They can't get enough of it here.
It's remarkable. I mean, I've even gone 3 or 4 years ago, Chad, there was a local place called Creswell Crags, which is known for being the largest collection of witch marks in Britain. A selection of caves. It's a wonderful place to visit and just spend some time wandering around this forgotten relic of the past. And they did a Krampus special, and it was I found myself getting very excited to see a Krampus, and I thought, I'm a middle-aged man.
Well, one thing I really learned on Krampus, and I thought I was pretty well versed in Krampus. I wasn't. But so Krampus, the story is that when you're naughty, of course, he'll whip you with a switch. But if you've been particularly ill-behaved, he would put you in his bucket and drag you back to hell with him. And that was kind of the overriding story I'd always heard. But when I was digging up some of the old newspaper accounts, I found a different version where he would bring you back to his lair and feed you to wild bears in the area, which I had never heard before. That, again, I always thought he just took you back to his lair and ate you or took you to hell, where now they're throwing in, no, he's going to feed you kind of to some wild bears that he's friendly with, which for me is just kind of creepy in its own right. And that was one I had never heard before until I started really digging deep.
Yeah. I remember seeing a documentary about a particular Krampus run in Austria, I think it was, and it was following somebody and it was their first year, Chad, of doing it. And if you do it the first year, you get marked for how scary you are. And the minimum pass mark is you have to make 10 children cry.
I'm amazed today that when I do presentations on winter legends and lore, and it's for all ages, so when there's children 10 and up in my audience, I'll damper down some of these stories and kind of whitewash them a bit. But I'm amazed at how many parents come up with their kids and say, oh yeah, my child loves Krampus, or my child loves cryptozoology. Its favorite creature is the Wendigo. And I'm thinking, what the heck is this 12-year-old doing? They're so much braver than I would have been at 12, because at 12, if I had ever heard of the Wendigo, which I hadn't at that point, I would have been not under my covers. I would have been under the bed. I mean, and these kids are like, yep, I love it. It's the best thing ever. I wish, you'd do more stories on the Wendigo. And it's just a kind of a change. And I don't know if that's people who have grown up in a horror culture kind of horror movies and the like, and all these theme parks of haunted hayrides and the like, where maybe that's enjoyable, but I'm always taken back by how many kids are fascinated with the scary and the bizarre.
Yeah. I mean, when I was 12, my introduction, I had a very sort of watered down version of the Wendigo, because there was obviously one of Marvel's characters who was a Canadian baddie was the Wendigo, who was one of Wolverine's enemies, Chad. So I had a very sort of lukewarm version of the Wendigo at that age, so I wasn't certainly aware of everything that I know now about these particular legends and the stories behind them. So yeah, I think if I'd have known then what I know now, I wouldn't have read those comics with such glee, I think.
The comic version, you're thinking, awesome, the Wendigo would show up? How cool would that be? This thing looks amazing. And then when you start to dig into the folklore, you think, I'm glad that it didn't show up.
I think as well, one of the confusions, and I've seen this a few times, is people seem to confuse or merge Krampus and Belsnickel, Chad. But they're very different characters, aren't they? They're similar, but they're clearly not the same kind of thing, are they?
Not at all. So Belsnickel came from the old countries as well, and it came over mainly with the Pennsylvania Dutch here in America out on the East Coast. And he was a disheveled figure of the woods, looked like he could commune with animals out there. And sometimes he'd have horns or antlers, and he'd be dressed in furs at other portions and wearing bells around, much like Krampus. But he would show up sometimes on Christmas Eve, sometimes before. And he would, tall, slender, again, look like a wild man of the woods. And he would announce his arrival at your home by dragging his filthy long nails against the glass of your bedroom window or the front door. And then he'd bang on the door and demand entrance into your home. And I can just imagine parents back then, if children weren't going to bed or they weren't listening, all they'd have to do is say, oh, that sounds like Belsnickel's bells out in the yard. We should have a look. And the kids would probably straighten up right away. So Belsnickel would come into the homes and he would let you plead your case for these children. He could ask how you've been, make your case, and then he would throw candies and treats and nuts on the floor. And those who had never witnessed him before would dash off to get it, and he would whip them with his switch. Where the older children knew you wait until Belsnickel leaves and then you gather up the goodies. and Belsnickel would have a pack on his back or a bucket as well on times. And it was said that, he was this wild man of the woods and with magical powers and the like. But what I found interesting is in the early 1900s here in America, many newspapers out on the East Coast in those communities were openly debating whether they should get rid of the tradition of Belsnickel because he was too terrifying. That they interviewed many adults who said, I have post-traumatic stress disorder because of my time at Belsnickel visiting my house. So, the idea of Belsnickel in a community coming from home to home, organized by the parents, it scarred people where as adults they said, I don't want to put my kid through this. But luckily, Belsnickel, as much as Krampus, has really reverted back to its original origins of being scary. And a lot of people mistakenly think of these creatures as the anti-Santa Claus, where I see them more as the yin and yang, Santa and Krampus or Belsnickel, or good cop, bad cop.
Yeah.
Where St. Nicholas, well, he'll reward you, but Krampus, not so much.
I mean, when you were doing this book, Chad, obviously you're someone who's got a deep knowledge of legends and lore and always looking out for new things. Were there things that you came across that you had never heard of or you were quite surprised? Because one of the things that happens here in certain areas of the UK is we have something called sword dances that happen at Boxing Day, which is obviously a bank holiday we have here in the UK that nobody else does because we just like bank holidays here. The day after Christmas. And so essentially it's a group of men who do a dance routine, which is essentially in regards, very similar to what we were saying about Wassailing, that they do this performance in regards to requesting a good year's harvest for the forthcoming year, and they do this performance on Boxing Day up and down certain... It's not as popular, obviously, as it used to be, but it's something that is, once again, having a bit of revival, because people seem to be really interested in some of these older traditions that have somehow managed to keep going in certain pockets of Britain. So when you were doing this, did you find anything like that you stumbled across and you thought, why have I never heard of this before?
Mostly with the traditions, but also with the creatures. Every country seems to have a couple winter creatures that are meant to terrify, inspire, or to warn. But there were just so many rituals that I was not aware of that I always joke that I don't know how our ancestors got anything done because they were adhering to all of these. For instance, it was thought that on Christmas Day, at midnight on Christmas Day, if you went out to a crossroads, that whatever was going to give you the most trouble and anxiety the following year, it would manifest itself at a crossroads and show itself to you.
Mm.
So you could go out there, and if it was a jilted lover or finances, whatever was going to cause you the most trouble of the following year, it would appear in front of you. I had never heard that, and I always warn people, be careful, because hellhounds like to operate at crossroads too. So if you're going out there to get your future, you might not have much of a future left if you're not careful. And if you don't believe me, just listen back to listeners. You can listen back to the show Paul did with my colleague and friend Kevin Nelson on hellhounds. That's out and available right now too. So I always joke that be careful, because a lot of this folklore can be dangerous.
Mm. Yeah, very much so. It is strange as well. Crossroads seem to have some kind of supernatural attachment to them for a lot of reasons, Chad. Not just because of that, but obviously when you look at when they used to punish highwaymen and build gibbets, they would often put them at crossroads so the spirit didn't know which way to go and things like that. So it's interesting how something predicting your fortune would also be attached to a crossroads as well.
Again, it was that yin and yang, that it's a little bit dangerous, 50-50, but I think that added to the excitement of it. And there were so many of those that I stumbled across. For instance, on Christmas Eve at midnight, it is said that you'll be able to hear bees singing Christmas carols.
Yes.
And I don't know, I always joke that I don't know if they buzz along or hum along or if they actually sing them, but that was the thought, that you could actually put your ear to the ground and hear some underground bees singing Christmas carols as well. So that was another one.
Yeah. I must admit, I was very surprised. I think when I was reading the bit, when you were talking about animals also on Christmas Eve are given the gift of speech for an hour, but your humans are not allowed to hear what they're talking about.
The legend dates back to the birth of Christ, that it was said that all the species of animal that were there to witness the new Savior were granted this ability on Christmas Eve to talk in a language which you could understand. But you're absolutely right that it was advised not to eavesdrop on them, because not only would they be just talking bad about you anyway, and who wants to hear that, but also it would bring you bad luck, that it was thought to be ill fortune to eavesdrop on the animals. So I always say that there are many other legends on Christmas Eve you could do, like sit under a pine tree at midnight and try to hear the angels singing. But if you do, it means you'll see the angels, because you'll die in the next year. So many of these traditions were meant to be scary, that if something happened, it meant you were going to die very shortly. So much like at midnight on Christmas Eve, you can pour water into wine, but if you drink the wine, the Grim Reaper will come after you. So many of these had precautionary tales associated with them, that you can do it if you're curious, but I wouldn't advise it.
Yeah. I often wonder in that regard, Chad, why would you be able to turn water into wine if you can't drink it? What's the point in that?
The whole idea is you were celebrating Jesus, that Jesus was able to do it, that you could be as well. But there's a flip side to that as well. And even though most scholars agree Jesus wasn't born in December, this is what we associate with him. Whereas if you were born during the 12 days of Christmas, which most people celebrate from the December 25th to January 6th, if you were born and celebrated a birthday during that time period, the legend was you'd be more likely to turn into a werewolf. And that you'd be given the gift of sight. You were psychic and you could talk to ghosts as well. And the reason for it was the thought that being born so close to the birth of the Savior, you were taking celebration away from his birthday and you'd be cursed. And that's why you'd be a werewolf, because in the old days, werewolves were thought to be most prevalent and powerful during the winter months.
Is it something that you find when you look at that, how often there are these kind of darker aspects? Do you think these are things that people just, because they don't fit in with the modern, happy, shiny Christmas, Chad, as we said, that a lot of these were just kind of pushed out because people didn't like the darkness interfering with their holiday celebrations? And now, when we have the world of information and knowledge at our fingertips with the internet, and regional lore and folklore are probably as popular as they ever have been, certainly in the modern era. Do you think that these darker things are the ones that are attracting more people and it's bringing them back? Because I was aware of the werewolf thing, but a lot of people are always surprised when they come across things like that.
For me, I think these legends and lore were pushed out because they were hard to market. They were hard. They interfered with you buying more presents, more jewelry, more everything. Spend. And I think more and more people are frustrated with that. And I think that's really led to the revival of these legends as more and more people search for something more and something more meaningful of the season. And a lot of this wasn't forgotten. It was just hidden. They're in newspapers. They're in the Farmer's Almanac for weather legends and folklore of winter. So it's out there. It's just you had to dig for it, which is one of the reasons I wanted to do this little book where I combined so many different things of winter monsters with how to predict you're going to have a terrible winter to the New Year's Eve celebrations, and all of it in one place where you didn't have to dig through it. You know, let me be the sucker to dig through all the stuff and dig it up. You just enjoy the fruits of it.
Yeah. I mean, that's one of the other things as well. I know you mentioned a wonderful thing that I always remember from my childhood, which was almanacs. And it's something that, once again, by the 90s, Chad, I very rarely saw them. But I always remember as a kid going to my grandparents, and my grandmother every year would have an almanac for the forthcoming year. These are something, once again, that seems to have had a new lease of life in the modern era. And when you look back at them, or look at the ones these days, it's basically a guidebook to all kinds of things. And once again, people would often use the world around them as a guide or a prediction of what was to come. They would try and predict how the weather would be so they would know how to plant their crops or rotate things or where to move their livestock. They were like the farmer's Bible for the forthcoming year, weren't they?
Remember, at a time when you were a farmer, if you could predict the weather or trends in the weather, that would be a valuable skill. That would either tip the scales in you surviving or failing. So the Farmer's Almanac, which dates back well over 140 plus years in print, was meant to give you that edge. And once the internet came out, it was thought, well, that's the end of the Farmer's Almanac. Why would you want to turn to a print magazine when you can just Google the weather? And the exact opposite has happened. People are craving that old print idea of sitting down, reading about whether or not your squirrel in your backyard has an extra bushy tail or not, and what that means for your oncoming winter. And again, it's just people, the same reason vinyl has come back, the same reason board games are back, is that these things come in cycles, but also it's that craving for more meaning. And I think it's the rebel against the screens that were, I have to use a screen much more than I would like to during the day. So I think it's that longing for something more and better.
Yeah. Well, I think the last thing I want to touch on before I let you go back to the darkness, Chad, is we can't really talk about legends and lore of winter and the dark without touching on one of our favourites, which is the Wendigo. Once again, this is another creature that I think, as we've developed in the modern era and through social media and YouTube and paranormal television, the Wendigo, once again, is probably as well known as it ever has been, Chad. Primarily as well, I would suggest, because I know a couple of people who wrote a fabulous book about it a couple of years ago.
Out of all the creatures in cryptozoology, there was no other creature that brought as much fear with it to North America than the Wendigo. And for those who heard me on your show, on our Wendigo episode, or read the book, you hear me telling the story of people actually starved in their lodging because they heard a Wendigo was in the vicinity. Nobody had seen it. Nobody had heard it, but the legend was it was in the area. So rather than to go out and hunt for food or gather, they starved to death in their lodging because that's how great the fear of the Wendigo was. And every time I talk about the Wendigo, for those who had never heard of it, they said, how is this possible that I never heard of this? Because it might be the oldest creature in North America for legends, yet is one of the, still today, the least known when you compare it to Bigfoot or the Loch Ness Monster or Mothman. And yet I think it's more complex, more fascinating, and more bizarre than nearly all of those legends combined.
I know when you were doing some TV, I think you were on In Search of Monsters a couple of years ago, Chad. There was a couple of brothers, I remember, because obviously I watched that particular episode as I watch anything to do with monsters on TV. I think most people would be shocked to hear that people are still claiming to have had encounters with such a creature. And you went and spoke to two brothers, I think it was, who had a very frightening experience with something they just couldn't explain.
They were staying at a camp in the summer in northern Wisconsin, at a historic, accurate old summer camp, which if you'd go there, you'd think, I don't know any kids who would want to stay here. It was pretty run down and rustic and authentic.
Yes.
1920s campground type thing. And they were staying there, and the two brothers who both had an experience with some monster on separate nights, unbeknownst to one another. One of them was playing cards downstairs with his buddies, and they saw this thing of death float by the window, this skeletal monster looking thing. And they alerted the camp counselors, and they took it seriously, but they didn't know if it was a bear or a wild, weird, bizarre person. But then the next night, the younger brother was walking back to his cabin with his buddy to get a thicker coat, a sweatshirt. And they saw something in the woods, this tall, thin, skeletal looking thing. And it was leaning against a tree where the brother told me that he thought if they took one step closer, this thing was going to kill them. They were overcome with fear, and an uncanny fear, not as though you're on a walk and you see a black bear or a moose, which can be terrifying, but this was something they had never experienced. And when they alerted the camp counselors, they implemented a policy that anyone who went outside had to have a partner with them. Because again, they didn't know if it was an insane man in the woods or an animal or what. So they took precautions. But it had been, I think, 2 years after that I interviewed them. And when they were telling me the story, I could still see the fear and their bodies shaking and the terrifying voice changing in them when they recounted the story, that it still stuck with them. And they didn't go in knowing what the Wendigo was. When they went home, they tried to figure out what they had seen, and they came across depictions of the Wendigo and said, that's exactly what we spotted. So it wasn't as though they were Wendigo buffs and they saw some shadow in the woods and thought it must have been the Wendigo. They were terrified. And their mother, who was there as well, and I interviewed her, she said she thinks it still affects them to this very day.
I think most people would be taken aback, like you say, Chad, because it's very easy, I suspect, to kind of brush this off. But as you say, when you spoke to them, despite the fact it was a couple of years, they were clearly still very traumatized by what they'd experienced, even though one of them, you would say that that wasn't a particularly traumatic experience, whereas if you're outside and you see this 7-foot jet black creature lurking, that really would put the fear into you.
They experienced what many people who encounter something out of the ordinary experience, almost as though they have stepped into a zone of fear, this irrational fear that the one brother, the older brother, inside a cabin with all of his friends and buddies. I mean, you could presume that he was safe, that this thing wasn't going to tear the roof off of the cabin and come in. But yet at the same time, he thought it was there to kill him. That he thought, if I don't move or stop looking, this thing is going to harm me. And that's so prevalent with witnesses, that they might be in the presumed safety of their vehicle, that they could drive away at any time, but yet they feel that if they don't get out of there, this thing's going to harm them, which for me puts these experiences much different than, misidentifying a moose or a mountain lion or something of that nature, that they, whatever they are, and I don't know what they are, that they're in a realm of their own. They're in a category far beyond normal fear.
Especially when you describe something as so elongated and skinny, Chad, that would kind of take it away from misidentification, because with the great respect, you're not going to misidentify a bear as a tall, skinny creature, are you?
Exactly. And a lot of people think, Wendigo's nothing more than a Sasquatch that's turned to killing people, where the origins of them and the descriptions couldn't be more different, where the Wendigo's always tall, 8 feet or as big as it wants to be, thin, tight skin pulled over its thin, muscly bones, and sometimes it's missing its own mouth and its lips because it has chewed them off, because it has an insatiable hunger for human flesh. And yeah, you're not going to think that that's Sasquatch. It's just completely different. And today, most of the depictions have antlers attached to it as well, which would, again, place it in a different looking category than Bigfoot or the Yeti.
Definitely. Absolutely. I think the one other aspect of this wonderful collection is the range of wonderful illustrations throughout it, Chad, by our good friend Morgan Knudsen. So once again, Morgan's one of those people that whatever she seems to turn her hand to, she just excels at it. Was it a question of, did you just tell us what you were going to focus on, Chad, or did Morgan kind of ask you, or did she just say, here you are, this is what you're getting?
I can't believe we made it through this whole interview without mentioning Morgan and her awesome, amazing artwork in this book. When I asked her to do the foreword, I knew she was a talented artist, and she had done some Krampus cards she had sent me years prior that I just loved. And I said, I'm working on this book that you're doing the foreword to. Would you be interested in doing the artwork? And I sent her the chapter headings, like what they would be and nothing else. I said, have fun. So I think there are like 20, 21 chapters. So I said, do 21 images for me. Thanks. And slowly these came in, and I was just floored, because I was hoping that when you work with an artist, you don't know if they're on the same level with you, with what you see for it. And I was envisioning like early 1900s, 1800s, like you feel like when you see the image of her having people decorate the Christmas tree with candles, that you were back in the 1800s in Germany. And it was just amazing that all of her work just flowed into exactly what I was thinking and hoping that it would represent. So I have no doubt there'll be people that purchase this just to see the images of what she's done. And I told her she needs to do like a calendar or something with these original art pieces, because they're just so fantastic. And I was just amazed. It's my favorite part. And a lot of people comment and tell me, I love the illustrations. I haven't read it yet, but I'm sure the chapters will be just as good. And I'm thinking, well, don't be too sure, because those illustrations are amazing.
Yeah, they are jaw-droppingly beautiful. I love the little people one. I found that one absolutely fantastic. The werewolf as well is particularly frightening, Chad. So they are just beautiful, and a real compliment to the quality of the writing and the stories included in it as well.
I love this book. I think it's going to be every year I'll pull it out, and I'll probably do a second version at some time, all new stuff, because there was just so much stuff. Or maybe I will make a definitive guide for those who are really crazy and want all of that. But I can't tell you how many people pick it up because it's thinner and buy it from my lectures because it's not that intimidating. Like the Wendigo book. People see the Wendigo book and think, oh, I'm in for a wild ride with this one. Whereas this Winter Legends is like, oh, I'm in for a nice little weekend away here.
No, well, it's brilliant. And like I say, it's always good. I mean, the other thing, as you mentioned there, because it's a slightly thinner book, it's one of those where you can look at the chapters and think, oh, well, I want to just read about that particular bit. It's one of those you can dive in and out of. You don't have to sort of sit down and just read it. You can just pick at it, can't you?
Yeah, definitely. And you can follow the season. You can read something about Christmas Eve legends and then hold off till New Year's, or hold off until the Epiphany, or on the solstice, open it up. So it kind of could last the whole season, even though it's a slim book.
Absolutely. Well, Chad, it's a marvellous collection, and thank you so much for giving us some depth and some knowledge in regards to the particular subjects included, and there are many more that we've not touched on. So, my friend, where can everybody get a hold of a copy, follow your work, and find out what you're up to next?
My website's probably easiest, Chad Lewis Research, and I've been on this show so many times now, Paul. I'm going to put on my resume that I'm the co-host. So there you go. A new resume holder for me. Co-host. Silent co-host on most episodes. But
you're there in spirit, my friend.
Yes, indeed. But keep an eye out. And thanks so much for having me back. I always love talking with you. And I love listening to all your other guests. Just great. One of the best in the business.
Thank you. Well, you take care hunting for that skunk, eh? And take some suntan lotion with you as well, Chad, if you're heading down south, my friend. Always a pleasure. Thank you as always. Take care, and we will speak soon.
Thanks. Avenge my death.